I have been.
Hello, Mar.
How are you?
I'm very well, thank you. How are you?
I'm okay. I'm okay. I'm so happy to be here. I've been looking forward to it all these days because I think your work is amazing. Can you tell us a bit about yourself so people get to know you a bit?
Yes, sure. So I've been publishing work since 2018.
Mm.
Was the first book that I put out, which was a memoir. So it was very different to my fiction work, which I've put out after that, which was all mostly horror and adult dark fiction with
Yeah.
erotic themes.
Mm.
So I do that. I'm an editor as well.
Mm.
Um, Vegan, home educating, out of the
Yes.
box crazy person.
That's awesome. And so, have you always liked to write? I mean, have you been one of these child that said, well, I want to be a writer, or there were a moment where you got into that world?
Honestly, I never thought I want to be a writer as a kid. However, I always wrote as a child. I was one of these people that always had a diary.
Yeah.
I always had a notebook in my pocket. And when I didn't have a notebook, I'd be scrolling notes on bus tickets and train tickets and
Yes.
scrap pieces of paper because I'd have my nose in a book or in a sketchbook all the time. So I would hear a lyric and that would just form a big string of a story in my head. So I would write little notes all over the place. But I never actually went out of my way and thought I want to be a writer. I've just always been a writer, but didn't have the courage to share anything that I wrote or
Yeah.
publish until I was much older.
Yes. And what kind of horror reader do you think your books are for? Which kind of sub-genre or kind of
Oh,
audience?
that's quite a tricky one because
Mm.
I dip my toes in lots of different subgenres of horror.
Yes.
I think that's one of the wonderful things about the horror genre,
Yeah.
um,
So wide.
is that, yeah, exactly. There's just so many options in it. And I think you could take one side of it like extreme horror, but you can put quiet gothic elements into extreme horror as well. Psychological horror is one of my favorite subgenres of horror, and my latest work that's coming out in May, that's very much a psychological piece. I think, again, that subgenre of horror can feed into lots of other areas in it. So, yeah.
Yes. And
But yeah, so
what do you think are your greatest influence in your work? Do you have like an author or kind of books that you see reflected in your books?
I'm not sure if I would say specifically other writers, like other horror authors specifically,
Yeah.
but I'm very much influenced by music.
Okay.
Um,
Yes.
so if I'm listening to a particular band or something, I'll get a lyric stuck in my head, and then I'll end up forming a whole host of characters around that lyric or a whole story,
Yeah.
or it'll be a noise or a smell or just something really silly
Yeah.
that then inspires this whole big thing. Writers in the horror genre that I love, like one of the first horror writers that I got into when I was young was Poppy Zebright. Poppy probably falls in the extreme category because the first book I read of Poppy's was Exquisite Corpse, and that I loved it. I loved how graphic it was, how violent it was, how psychological it was as well. Yeah, so she's probably he's probably a big influence for sure.
Yeah. And are you into horror movies too? Do you like movies?
Oh, oh yes,
Yes.
definitely.
And do you
Definitely.
prefer the current kind of horror, or are you a traditional horror kind of fan?
I like it all really. When it came to horror movies, I used to watch a lot of horror. I stayed with my grandmother as a kid every single weekend, and
Yes.
she never ever filtered content. So we would usually have horror movie marathons when I was
Yeah,
really young,
that's
and then we would watch
amazing.
She used to love old religious horror like The Omen, and like the Birds movies like that. Hellraiser movies and stuff like that as well when they came out in the later 80s. I watched a lot of 80s horror being a child of the 80s. That's just what happened. But I like some of the remakes that have happened now of like Suspiria. I saw that like maybe 2 years ago, the remake of Suspiria, and I absolutely adored the new
Yes.
twist on that. It was masterful. It was really good. I like sci-fi horror too.
Yes.
Like Splice and movies like that. Really
Yes.
good.
The sci-fi goes together with horror a lot of times. It's very difficult to draw the line between the two of them. And do you have now the book Asylum Daughter, right? I think it's a special book. Can you tell us a bit about it?
Yeah, of course. So my upcoming novella, Asylum Daughter, that's due out on May the 8th. And you actually ran a feature on your fantastic website. Thank you so much for that. I loved it. It was beautiful.
No, I'm the lucky one. I was impressed by everything, by the blurb and the cover. The cover is pretty disturbing. I mean, it's a book that catches your attention, really. So yeah.
Thank you. I
Yes.
appreciate that. The cover was designed by Rooster Republic Press, so Don Noble. He's done a lot of work for a lot of kind of up and coming indie horror authors, a lot of horror authors. I think he does a lot of sci-fi too, actually, in his work. So he designed the imagery for that. But yeah, so the book that comes out in May the 8th, that's one. It's a story that's been bubbling for quite a long time.
Yes.
And I had like bits and pieces of it written down because I tend to write. I'll write poetry or I'll write a paragraph of something and then I'll build on it. I'm a bit of a knitter, I suppose, when it comes to writing stories. Yes. I'll part pieces here and there. So Asylum Daughter started a bit like that. And then last year I was like, right, I have to get this story done. These characters are annoying me now because they're saying, just get our story finished, will you? You've left us in limbo. Just get it done. Yeah. So I did. I gave myself a kick and we got it out there. So that's a psychological horror that spans between the early 1980s through to present day.
Okay.
And it's very female driven. So my main protagonist, Bella Mills, it's a story about her. She goes through a violent attack as a child. Her family get killed. And her mother was actually a patient in an asylum called Lockwood Asylum. Okay. So 23 years later after that attack, she starts putting pieces of her past together, shall we say, and things aren't what she was led to believe they were. Yeah. But there's a lot of different elements in the story, but it is pretty dark. So it comes with a trigger warning.
Yeah, it really seems dark. I mean, it's I'm used to see a lot of blurbs, a lot of covers, a lot of features, other websites, and sometimes there are things that just catch your attention. And I think that your book is one of them, and I think it's a very good recommendation for any kind of horror fan, because the psychological horror touches a lot of different buttons on horror fans. Like psychological horror can be from demons to psychopaths and it's definitely my favorite one, because I'm not, I mean, the blood and guts and all of that, it's fun in horror, but it's something fun. Yeah. So it doesn't steal my sleep, you know.
Yeah, I totally get where you're coming from. It's like easy viewing, easy reading. When you've got blood and guts, you're like, oh yeah, that's a bit of fun, but it doesn't stick with you, and it doesn't burn in your mind the way something psychological would, where you could think, oh my goodness, that's something that could happen. That's something that could happen to me. It could happen to my child. It could happen, you know.
That's the scary part, when you're alone at home and you suddenly think of something like that, like and you watch over your shoulder. That's that's the real horror. That just like the slasher kind of horror. Like, I mean, I'm the #1 fan of The Evil Dead, for example. I love it. I
yeah.
every single time. It's amazing, but it's not a scary.
Yeah.
It's just
No,
fun.
no, it's just so much fun.
Exactly.